Now, I welcome all the panelists here, and I would like to invite our first panelist of the session, Mr. Rajan Basra, Research Fellow of International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College, London. You have the floor.
Brilliant. Thank you. So over the next 10 minutes, I want to give a snapshot of the overlaps between crime and terrorism in Europe in the context of terrorism inspired by Al-Qaida and ISIS. And I suppose it makes sense to start with an episode from 2016, which I think is overlooked, but very revealing. And it concerns this young man. His name was Mesa Hodzic, and his story goes that one night on the summer of 2016 in Copenhagen, he was approached by two plainclothes police officers. And without warning, Mesa pulled out a pistol. He shot the two police officers, he shot a bystander for good measure, and then he ran off into the night. Eventually, after a manhunt and a shootout, Danish police located Mesa, and he subsequently died of his injuries. Now, when they looked through his apartment, they found that he had 50 kilos of hashish there, and over 1,000 joints that were already rolled and that he was selling in the streets. So he was quite a prolific drug dealer. But where the story gets interesting for us is when the Islamic State gets involved. Because after he died, they issued a bulletin saying that he was a soldier of the Caliphate. And it turned out that Mesa had appeared in propaganda videos for a banned violent Islamist organization. So this is a bit of a conundrum. Was Mesa a drug dealer? Was he a soldier of the Caliphate? Or was he actually both at the same time? And in one case, this is essentially what we're seeing throughout Europe, where criminals, petty criminals, are becoming involved in jihadism. And I suppose this is very different from what the situation was in Europe 20 years ago, when you look at the Hamburg cell responsible for the attacks here in 9/11. If you analyze them and their peers, you would find that the majority were actually involved in university education. They were from middle or upper class backgrounds, and they were in skilled employment. These were the so-called engineers of jihad. And of course, this profile still exists today, as you see in the attacks in Sri Lanka. But if you compare it to what we see in Europe now, looking at those that have traveled to Syria and Iraq to join groups like Islamic State, and those that have carried out attacks on the continent, you see a very different picture. So of the 800 or so foreign terrorist fighters from Germany, German police have revealed figures that show that only 12% were university educated, the majority were known to the police, and a third had criminal convictions, and 25% were unemployed. And this is in a country with very low levels of youth unemployment. So there's been a general shift, not a total shift, but a general one. And we see this elsewhere in Europe. So if in Germany a third had criminal convictions, the same is true in Spain. When you look at people convicted for jihadism-related offenses in the last 5 years, a third of them already had convictions as common criminals. 44% of Italy's foreign terrorist fighters were also known as petty delinquents. In the UK, you look at the converts that traveled to Syria and Iraq, you're looking at the same picture. In France, the foreign terrorist fighters believed to have died in conflict. You'll see that half of them were common criminals as well. And in Belgium, the Federal Prosecutor's Office have said that 50% of the country's foreign terrorist fighters also had criminal convictions. We've spoken with counter-terrorism officials in Norway who said over 60% apply there. And in Netherlands, analysis of police files show that 64% of foreign fighters and would-be foreign fighters also were the subject of police reports for common crimes. So all over Europe, we're seeing literally hundreds of criminals get involved in terrorism. So what is going on? Well, myself, Peter Newman, and a team at ICSR, we've constructed a database to look at these criminals turned terrorists to understand their life stories, their process of radicalization, and how they operate. And when we look at this cohort, what do we see? Well, they were petty and violent criminals. who had histories in pretty low-level drug dealing, committing fraud, theft, as well as assaults and stabbings. But we're generally not seeing profiles that was associated with organized crime. It's much more low-level. And once they do radicalize, they use their criminal skills in the service of terrorism. So if they want to get a hold of a firearm, well, they tap into their criminal networks to do so. In addition, they find redemption or a purification by involving themselves in terrorism. It promises them this idea of martyrdom and wiping the slate clean. And it's easy to see why this would appeal to a criminal with questions on his mind. It also legitimizes criminal acts as well, because we've consistently seen that jihadist recruiters and cells have given themselves a license, if you will, to commit crime for the sake of terrorism. So we're talking about low-level robberies, thefts, VAT fraud, and so on. But by and large, what we're experiencing in Europe is the convergence, it's the mixture of criminal and extremist milieux. And this is to say, we're not looking at it from an organizational level. It's not the case that the Italian 'Ndrangheta is doing business with Islamic State. We're talking about something much more low-level and grassroots, where the same networks, the locations, the places that often give rise to criminals are now also giving rise to terrorists. And this phenomenon that we see in Europe has really important implications relating to terrorist financing, to how we share information, to law enforcement responses. But I'll highlight two just now. The first implication is that we really need to rethink what it means to be a radical. And the best example I can give you concerns this man, Anis Amri. And in 2016, he hijacked that lorry, drove it into a Christmas market in Berlin, and he killed a dozen people. In the aftermath of that attack, it was revealed that Anis Amri was actually under police surveillance in the months leading up to his attack. And what police saw him doing was dealing drugs like cocaine and ecstasy in the streets of Berlin. And they also saw him consuming those drugs as well. And because of this, this factored into their decision to say that he was no longer a threat, because they could not conceptualize that you could simultaneously be involved in criminal activities, even consuming drugs, whilst being involved in terrorism. And so in the aftermath, the chief of Berlin Criminal Police actually said that his behavior corresponded with a checklist of un-Islamic behaviors. So they still had this conception of terrorism in Europe as being like the Hamburg cell, that were perhaps more interested in theology, that claimed to be religiously pious and observant. And they hadn't seen the shift where criminals and extremists are now mixing. Another implication that I think is really important is that we must focus on prisons, because throughout Europe we're seeing record numbers of terrorists behind bars. And these are figures taken from the justice ministries in various European countries from last year. In Belgium, there are an estimated 450 radical Islamists inside their prison service. In Italy, you're looking at almost 500. In the UK, the Ministry of Justice have said 700 inmates are suspected of being radical. And in France, a massive 1,800 Islamist extremists are behind bars. Now, the reality is that they won't stay in prison forever. They're often on quite short sentences. And so we must prepare ourselves for what happens when they're eventually released. And recent years have shown us what can happen inside prison, because we consistently see examples where someone enters as a criminal and then they're introduced to either radical ideas or networks within prison, and then they leave as a committed jihadist. France especially has borne the brunt of this. We've seen the case here of Clement Beau and Mahidine Merabet, who met in prison, and then a few months later, after they were released, were planning an attack in France after they were caught with a Uzi submachine gun and 3 kilos of TATP. But we've seen other cases within France as well, where terrorist attacks have been planned within prison and executed shortly after release. We've seen inmates in contact with violent Islamists based abroad. And we've also seen attacks on prison guards, so within the prison walls themselves, in the furtherance of terrorism. So I feel over the next few years, when a lot of these inmates are going to be released, we're going to have to be faced with the reality of how do we manage the risk that they pose, how do we integrate them into society if possible, and how do we manage this issue of prison radicalization. So these are some of the implications of the merging of criminal and extremist milieux that we see in Europe. Thank you.